Thank you very much, Akhilesh. A very good afternoon to all of you. Professor Steve Rogers, Deputy Vice Chancellor, Mark and colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor and privilege to be here. For last 2 days, we visited NT Bushfire organization. Also, this morning actually we visited NT emergency services, and we tried to learn quite a bit of lessons. Of course, it's only 1 hour, 2 hour meeting, but we could, I think, get quite a bit of deep insights on the voluntarism which is there in Australia, which is actually very, very systematic. There are lots of protocol, guidelines, training, and it's very rigorous in some sense. And for Japan, possibly, we don't have that much of rigorous training and organized system, which possibly evolved more organically over years through experiences. So I would like to share some of the experiences here. And of course, we are very much thankful to our funding agency, which is the Australia-Japan Fund of the DFAT, DFAT, and also our sincere thanks to Akhilesh actually to initiate this whole program. This is a very interesting mutual learning program. With my experience working in Japan, I was born in India, living in Japan for 30 years now. So more than half of my life I spent in Japan and tried to learn from different experiences. But my experience does not come only from the university. You can see a couple of other affiliations which I have with the science policy interface with the UN, where I work with mainly the UN offices in IPCC for more on the policy aspect. Then, of course, we have a little bit of work experience with some youth and innovation, especially through some establishing the startups, and try to understand what the young generation think about disaster risk reduction. And of course, I also am the board chair of a couple of Japanese NGOs, and my main work from the voluntarism possibly actually comes from there. So, cannot see this one. That box.
Yeah, it's a bit.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think, like we now talk about the voluntarism in a more formal way, but voluntarism, I think it comes from very simple thing, which is the human compassion. When people just see somebody is in need and somebody needs to help themselves. And this particular compassion, I think for any country, it exists over a period of the years, before our formal system, before the governance, before all the ministries actually came in. For case of Japan also it's the same thing. Like we had this water volunteer and fire volunteer, because Japan being a very disaster-prone country, we have been living with disasters, either with earthquake, flood, typhoon, landslide, volcanic eruption, so everything is there. So naturally, before even the governance or the real government or the ministry came in, it was the people who were helping. So there was a traditional system in Japanese we call Suibodan, which is the water volunteer, and which is mainly working more on the fire and water related disasters, the flood and the water related disaster. And another one is the Sobodan, because in Japan most of the buildings are the wooden buildings, so fire has been a very prominent hazard in many cases. So that was the fire volunteer. This is a photograph which, like now the Japan's river systems, of course most of the major rivers have its dike, so there is the ministry who manages the dike, so you really don't need to look at the river management from the community perspective. But in the old days, they used to have this ring dike where people make this a little bit of elevated boundary and settlement, when settlements were there. And it was people's responsibility in like they used to do even during the overnight, and it's a rotating thing. So that very basic principles actually for working with the community, or working with not only for myself but working with somebody else, very specific theme I think is very, very important. And that is possibly the base of the whole community-based disaster risk reduction system which currently exists in Japan. So again, the community-based, or when we say the community-based disaster risk reduction, I always try to show this particular photo on the left-hand side. Like it's very difficult to show a photograph of the community-based action sometimes. But this is a very traditional village in northwestern part of Japan, where you have this type of thatched roof. And these roofs are usually replaced once in 30-35 years. And the people who are actually working there, they are all the community volunteers. They come from the local village. So it's like they are not paid workers, so nobody pays for their time. But when I replace my roof, my neighbors will help me. And on the contrary, it's an unwritten rule that when my neighbors also need the same help, I will help them. So that type of very traditional community volunteer, this is not very specifically for the disaster, but this is just to help each other in the daily life also. So that type of concept actually, this is the concept of what we call the mutual assistance, which is the concept of the trust or the social norms which exist in the people for many years. But 1995, the Kobe earthquake, or what we call the Hanshin-Awari earthquake, that was one of the major earthquakes in post-World War II Japan, where 6,400 people lost their lives. That is what we call the year zero of voluntarism in Japan. So that is the timing. This earthquake happened on 17th of January. So usually in most of the schools, they get holiday from middle of, or end of January. Most of the school and the universities, they get holidays. So we saw a huge influx of these young people, mostly the students from different parts of Japan. They came to, they just saw that the whole city was burning, so many people lost their lives, and all the, those days social media was not there. It was mostly the TV programs where you saw different types of visuals. So people just went there without any thought, or without any second thought, but just they wanted to help people. That I know personally many of them who actually, like now it is 27 years, 28 years actually this year. So I know that they actually started living there, and then they got their work in Kobe and so on. So they became actually the local residents. But they went there, many of them went there in the senior high school or even in the university student. One of the important issues we found that there were not that much of preparedness among the volunteers, because they just went there to help. But when you know that in a disaster-stricken area there are always resource constraints, whether it is food or blanket or places to live or water and so on. So the volunteers need to be prepared, but they were not prepared. So there were lots of actually pressure on the very scarce resource, and that actually helped us in thinking that, okay, we need possibly a different, of course passion is very important, that's the key thing that people come, but there needs to be certain level of preparedness, there needs to be certain level of protocol in place. So that's how it was. So we say that this is the year zero of the voluntarism, but then there were designated volunteer system gradually over a period of time. I will come back to that later. But there are lots of different types of we found also, we did some analysis on this and wrote a paper also on this one, that how the different nature of volunteers actually changes. Maybe at the initial stage, within a few weeks to months, you need someone who can just help to clear the rubbles and all these things. But then when you go for a little bit on the immediate recovery or a little bit on the short-term, medium-term recovery, possibly there were the different needs in the volunteers. So we found that lots of students with the urban planning background from the local university, they actually worked with the local communities to develop their own redevelopment plan. Of course, there is a guideline from the local government, but the students help, and they were mostly from the urban planning department. So, and they had at least the basic knowledge about that, how a city developed and all those type of things. So this type of very small local sort of subject speciality in the voluntarism actually gradually came in, and which is again a new thing for us to enter into this whole voluntarism thing. 10 years later, 2004, this was an year of typhoons in Japan. Usually, like, there are so many typhoons. Now, actually, there is one major typhoon which is now going towards Japan. I think maybe today and tomorrow will be the major rainfall. But this 2004, we found around 17 major typhoon which hits the mainland Japan. So it was really a very bad disaster year for us. And we have found that this is a small city where we did some work. It is in the northern part of Hyogo prefecture, the same prefecture where the earthquake happened in 1995. But here we found that there was a totally different volunteer system over which was actually developed in the 10 years. One important thing was that the volunteer coordination center was set up within the city government. So the city government had the information that what are the needs in different places. So they could actually they could help that particular information sharing between the government and these non-government organizations who were doing the volunteer coordination. That was very, very important. Another interesting thing actually, that was one of my master's student actually did this particular analysis. So she collected in 60 different this type of water related disasters, and what you see is that whole garbage which is coming up here. It takes huge amount of resources, both in terms of human resource as well as cost, to clean that one, then segregate that one, and then make it a proper sort of treatment. So our research found that when you throw the garbage, if there are very minimum types of segregation, like you put the, say for example, this type of TV or other electronic equipments in one place, maybe just little bit of reorganization of that actually reduced the cost, the total treatment cost by 30%. And this was the data of almost 60 different types of water related hazard. But the problem is, like, if my house is flooded and my main priority will be just to clean up the things, as at that time I cannot think about, oh, I have to be environmentally conscious that to segregate this and that. So I cannot do that. But the volunteers who are coming possibly from outside, so what we did here, just make a very simple leaflet, give it to the volunteers and just help that, and that actually worked very well. So again, the key point here is that it's not a formal training, but just the key information for waste segregation at the source really actually reduced the cost of the treatment. So that was one of the major learning in this. 2011 East Japan earthquake and tsunami, that was again one of the major disasters. We worked in many of the cities and municipalities, and there we found again new types of volunteerism which came in. Of course, one is like the people went there to clean up, because it was a very massive disaster. There are 42 plus municipalities who were affected, so lots of needs of the volunteers, and that was there. But after that, actually what we did, and one of my, like I told that I'm the board chair of two non-profit organizations, so one of them called Seeds Asia. So we and this local, Kesennuma is a city name, Kesennuma Reconstruction Agency, so they actually recruited some volunteers, and the people who are seeing, whom you are seeing in the orange color, so they were the volunteers. Because one of the major problems here in Japan, first, when a disaster happens, you move to the local public facility, which is the school or maybe some community hall or something. So that is what we call the emergency shelter. After the emergency shelter, then depending on the nature of the scale of the disaster, we move them to temporary housing. And the temporary housing are provided by the government. It's free of charge, but you can stay there until your new house is constructed. And the duration of the temporary housing can be usually 2 to 3 years, but for this type of major disaster, it went up to 7 years, because that's when the tsunami came, there were lots of land readjustment. You cannot live in this coastal area. Some people need to be relocated, so there are new areas to be designated. So that took long process. So people actually live in this temporary shelter. So the point of the temporary shelter is that my residence was chosen by neighbor. So my residence was, I'm telling it the other way. My neighbor was chosen by lottery system, just to make an uniformity so that everyone gets an equal opportunity. So the challenge here that I don't know my neighbor. Now, there is a new community which needs to be formed. So there what we did is that with this volunteer activity, what we did is that we tried to make some small simple tea party type of thing so that people come. And usually, like, like Japanese people are very, it's not that much of outspoken. And even within Japan, we have seen in many disaster cases, northern Japan and the west or southern Japan people have totally different nature. South or west, they are a little bit of more vocal, but in northern Japan it's very difficult to make them talk in front of a stranger. And that was one of the major challenges. So what happened, what we used to do is, we used to do this type of just hot bath, foot massage type of thing, and these were all done by the volunteers. And then when they become a little bit relaxed, then they will start talking to there are maybe 5 or 6 people doing like this, so they will not talk here, but they will start talking with the person who is doing this massage. So that's where the communication started. So then these are all trained like foot massager. So then they will start talking to another person. So what do you think? What happened like that? So then that's where this communication actually started. So we found that this is a very, very sort of informal / non-formal way of starting this communication. And then these volunteers who were trained earlier, so they pick up the issues, that what are the key challenges, what is happening, whether it is the mental health agony, whether it is the job, whether it is the other health, physical health related issue, whether it is the neighbor relation, sometimes alcoholism, the two people are very worried, so there are lots of, they are drinking too much of alcohol, whether that type of issues are coming up. So we actually, at the end of the day, then we make some little bit of analysis, and then we provide a report to the local government that in this particular temporary shelter, these are the issues. But these are all done by the volunteers, and again, is a very informal way of volunteering. But another interesting thing also came in, this is also one of my master students' work, that this invisible volunteerism, what we say. The people who are there with a jacket, with orange color, so that's a very visible volunteerism. But there were lots of people, especially the social media analysts, who were in front of the computer, and I personally talked to many of them. They told that their parents are telling them that, you see, there is a major disaster, so many people they are going into there, what you are doing? Are you doing the video games or something? But they were not doing the video game, they were actually sitting and trying to analyze each of the tweets, because nowadays we can do it with AI and all this thing, but it were all manual. So how many tweets with that hashtag, and then putting that, extracting that information, providing that. So being in front of the computer, not going to the field, it's such an invisible volunteer, and these are often not recognized. So we actually wrote a paper of that one. So how you make that, it's very invisible, but it's a very, very important work. So how we recognize their activities in the volunteerism, I think that's also a very important thing. And I would just like to give you this information that after all these years, I told that 1995 was the year 0, but it took us almost more than 20 years to establish a formalized organization, which is the Japan, it's called the JVOR, Japan Voluntary Organizations Active in Disaster. So it is now a formal organization, so it is participation from the government because they provide the logistic support also, and then also the NGO, NPO sector, and also lots of corporate sectors who are involved because they give lots of corporate donations for the different types of issues and so on. So like in 2004, actually a 10-person team, they went to Washington DC, tried to understand the US mechanism of the volunteerism, which is this National Volunteer Organization, and also in FEMA, and then in 2014 they had some sort of national meeting. 2015 we had the Sendai conference, which is the Sendai framework, the world conference. So there also they made the presentation, and then finally 2016, 1st of November, this was actually established. So now they have regional offices, like say for example, we had a major earthquake in Kumamoto, and now they have the Kumamoto Voluntary Organization Active in Disaster. So it's called KVOAD. So in this type of regional thing, and now not only after the earthquake, now because in Japan we are expecting anytime a major big one, another major earthquake and tsunami. So there are now in anticipation, so they have established this type of regional organizations which are happening there. And also a new thing also this new technology and voluntarism, because as you know that now this is possibly in Japan we call society 5.0, which is like the new technology driven society. 1.0 was the hunting society, 2.0 was agriculture, 3.0 was industry, 4.0 is the current one, which is information, and 5.0 is the futuristic society, which is with AI and all new types of disruptive technology. And there again, these youth are coming very strongly to make lots of inputs as a volunteer. So we have these Sky volunteers who are the drone specialists, and they actually help in many cases for the overall assessment of the area. This actually started very strongly after the Fukushima incident, because there were not that many people who can go and see the conditions, so the aerial survey was very, very strong. And then also they helped in the Nepal and Indonesia also after several organizations. And the final one is this adaptive voluntarism, what I say, is like in Kumamoto, this is a place in the western part of Japan. We had a major flooding in 2020, and 2020 October, if you remember, that was the time when we had COVID-19, but that was the time when the vaccines came in, because Japan started the vaccination drive in 2021, January, February. So that time there was no vaccine, still people were very unsure about the nature of the disease. So there are many problems that even people didn't want to go to this evacuation shelter. So there was a new type of voluntarism which started. So this corporate sector, the university, Kumamoto University, and the prefecture government. So they started the volunteer, because they did not accept volunteers outside the prefecture, because there was a little bit of travel ban also during that time. Japan did not have a lockdown, but there was some national emergencies which were announced. So they actually managed within the whole prefecture, so which type of activities they can do. So lots of new learning there. So I think this is my last slide, that there are many things. Possibly what I told is again a very small snapshot of this very in-depth voluntarism evolution in Japan. But I think the flexibility in the system to absorb volunteers is very, very important. We need a system definitely, but the system and what we actually see in the ground are possibly quite different. And with all other climate change issues, the new type of risk, I think it's always very difficult to change all the regulation, but we can always have this local flexibility. So that's what we call the adaptive voluntarism. So basic system data, but again expertise is required. And one of the very important part, I think what we have found also, that it is the community or the host who will actually accept the volunteers. So we have to really respect their wishes, the local wishes, what they really need. It's not that what we want to serve. So that, I think, point is very, very important. So I think that's also very important for the community governance. So yes, I think these are some of the other examples. I will not go into the details, but this type of voluntarism happened. And that was actually one of my main learning. This was in 2002 in Afghanistan after the Taliban collapse, the previous Taliban regime. So that time I used to work for a small UN office in Kobe. So we went there after the earthquake, and then I could see that Taliban actually destroyed the whole governance system, but they could not destroy this very basic community governance system which exists. And this is called Shura, S-H-U-R-A, Shura, and without their permission you cannot actually enter into the villages. So they are all community, the volunteers, local people. The similar thing exists whether it is in Bangladesh with the women's group, we call them the Mothers Club. Similarly, this is in Vietnam, which is the Farmers Association and so on. So there are always, in every country, I think it has its own nature. And I think very recently actually I came to this particular word, this compassion-based approach. So there was a workshop actually with Ian Davis and Vinod Menon. And Ian Davis is a very famous professor. We call him sort of did DRR guru. So he was in Oxford Brookes, and we have read actually many of his papers. So we were doing a seminar just a couple of weeks back. So the topic was compassion-based approach. So I thought that this community-based approach, voluntarism is everything. I think the core is this compassion for someone to help. So I think these 3-4 words: self-help, mutual help, public help, and network help. So that's how it works. And but again, we always need to keep in mind that this is the whole world is changing, society is changing. In Japan, as I mentioned, 5.0, society 5.0. So maybe 10 years down the line, 15 years down the line, 20 years down the line, there will be totally a new futuristic society. So we need to actually keep that in mind, that how our system can absorb all those different types of changes. So I think with that, I end my presentation here. Thank you very much for your patient listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Shaw. Very comprehensive and inspiring presentation, and we can see the entire evolution of the volunteering system in Japan through his presentation. And it was quite enlightening to hear the Society 1.0 to Society 5.0 evolution as well. I'm sure we are at Society 4.0 at the moment in Australia, but I think CDU is fast transforming to Society 5.0 because we were the early grabbers of the technology. For example, online learning and teaching, when it was introduced, I mean, it is more prominent after the COVID, but CDU has adopted the online learning methods and technologies in the early 2000s, 2003 or 4 onwards. We have practiced these things. So I think we are probably at the forefront of moving to Society 5.0. We may be a step behind.
I think you're absolutely right. We talk about Industry 4.0.
Oh yeah.
Because Industry 4.0 is the post-digital. We haven't got to Industry 5.0 yet.
Okay.
Maybe one day.
Thank you. Thank you very much again. And I'm conscious of the time. You have to go at 3.